Good morning, I'm Kate Forsyth and I am an author.
And hi, my name's Belinda Murrell and I'm an author too, but I'm also Kate's sister.
And we are the authors of a book together, which is called Searching for Charlotte.
Searching for Charlotte. We're so excited about it.
It's the fascinating story of Australia's first children's author. And Charlotte Waring-Atkinson was actually our great-great-great-great-grandmother.
So we're so excited to be here today in the National Library with this amazing collection because we spent months researching this book, and a lot of our time was spent obviously researching Charlotte's life with some of these amazing things. And so we're so thrilled to be here in front of a first edition of a book written by our great-great-great-great-grandmother, which was published in 1841, but also a first edition book of a book written by our great-great-great-great-grandfather, James Atkinson, which was published in 1826, and here they are. It's so special.
It is. It's such a lovely experience for us to be here. The story of how the National Library came to have this wonderful collection of our ancestors' writings is one of the saddest and most poignant stories ever. So James Atkinson and his wife Charlotte Waring-Atkinson had 4 children, and their youngest daughter Louisa is actually Australia's first native-born novelist, journalist and botanist. And when she was a young woman, she had a little girl, a baby, whose name was Louise. And one day, she was looking after her child, and her husband, his horse, came galloping into the yard of their house, riderless. And Louisa Atkinson was so overcome with terror at what might have happened to her husband that she had a heart attack, and she actually dropped dead. And so when her husband came limping into the yard, he found her lying dead next to the cradle of their newborn baby.
It was such a sad story, and one of the things we found when we were researching this story is there were so many moments of absolute triumph and joy, but there were also so many incidents that were so tragic and so sad. I found myself weeping often while we were researching this book. But Louise played a very important part in this story because when she was 15 years old, she was an orphan. Her mother had died when she was a tiny baby. Her father died not long after, and she was raised by relatives, and she had a really unhappy childhood. And then when she was 15 years old, her aunt, everybody in the family had died, and her aunt decided to sell the grand, huge house of Oldbury and burn everything. So she was making this massive bonfire, but she said to Louise, "You can come and take away what you can carry." And that little 15-year-old girl had to walk over fields and over hills and down dales to the house, and she could gather up off that bonfire anything that she could carry home. So everything that we have now in the National Library and in the Mitchell Library, the State Library in Sydney, is what that little girl Louise carried, walked 5 kilometres, gathered off that bonfire, everything she could carry, and then she had to walk home 5 kilometres carrying all these precious, amazing things so that we have them now. And I just, I bless that little girl. I think she was just so amazing. But then I also want to weep for that bonfire of all the treasures that were actually burnt in that massive bonfire so long ago. So yes, it is a sad and a poignant story, but how lucky we are to have these amazing things that Louise saved from that bonfire.
And we could never have written our book if we hadn't had access to this wonderful collection. So we have here at the National Library, we have things including, as well as the first editions of James Atkinson and Charlotte Waring-Atkinson's books, which was the first children's book published in Australia. We also have such lovely things as the little Bible that Louise Snowdon was given on her christening, and when she was married she carried that Bible in her bouquet at her wedding. Yes. It's such a beautiful little touch. We have newspaper articles, there are drawings, photographs, sketchbooks, all sorts of ephemera.
Absolutely. Boxes. Kate and I came down to the National Library and we must have had 40 boxes that were jam-packed full of tiny little documents, handwritten letters, and some of them are so incredibly difficult to decipher. My personal favourite in the collection is Charlotte's Shipboard journal, which she wrote in 1826 when she was coming out to Australia, and she sat there every day in the cuddy writing in her journal about things that happened on board. And she had this, it gives us a real insight into her personality. She was fun-loving, she loved to laugh, she was so determined, and she just saw the whole thing as a great adventure. But the very special thing about this book is it actually records the romance between her and her husband, James Atkinson. And so she came on board the ship at Gravesend, and Kate and I went during our research to Gravesend, and we walked the cobblestones where they walked. And she came on board the ship, and then she met James Atkinson, and he tipped his hat to her as he came up the gangplank. And we've been told that story as part of our family mythology ever since we were little tiny girls. And the other story that I absolutely loved that we were told as girls was that as part of their courtship ritual, James Atkinson, when she was cold, he would wrap Charlotte in his plaid cloak. And I was so thrilled when I transcribed this journal in 2012, and I found the very first reference to the plaid cloak, that this wasn't just family mythology, it wasn't something that someone had made up, it was actually based in fact. And there was this first reference twice in the journal. She refers to James wrapping her in his plaid cloak, and the first time she was sitting on the poop deck and she was cold and she was sitting there watching the scenery wrapped in his cloak, only a couple of days after she'd met him. And then later on there was this terrifying storm at sea, and Charlotte nearly drowned, and she got smashed by a wave, and she had all those big heavy petticoats, and she was under the water and she couldn't get up and she was drowning, and James scooped in, picked her up, and then saved her life, and then wrapped her in his plaid cloak. And it's this absolutely beautiful romantic story. And the next day he proposed to her. So it was love at first sight.
That's what we were always told when we were kids. It was love at first sight.
He was the love of her life. And this story is just beautifully preserved in this journal that just took months to transcribe. So this is my favourite. This is my favourite thing in the collection. But it led us to another amazing discovery, this story of the plaid cloak, which we first heard as oral history. Then this was confirmed by transcribing the journal. And then what happened was when we were at the Mitchell Library, we were going through a whole lot of archives there, and we found this sketchbook that had been misattributed to Charlotte's son, James John. And as we're turning the pages, we're thinking, this is not the work of a teenage boy, this is Charlotte's work. So that was an amazing discovery. But then I turned the page, and there's this beautiful self-portrait of this beautiful woman wrapped in a plaid cloak. And we're in the Mitchell Library, everyone's quiet, and I scream out, I go, oh my God, she's wearing a plaid cloak! And everyone looks at me, glares at me as if ready to throw me out. And of course, this was the first discovery of this beautiful self-portrait of Charlotte as a young woman, glowing with love and happiness and roses and wrapped in a plaid cloak.
And when we started this journey, when we decided that we were going to write a book inspired by the life of Charlotte Waring Atkinson, our ancestor who wrote the first children's book published in Australia, we were not sure if there were any discoveries left to be made. Both James Atkinson, Charlotte Waring Atkinson, and their daughter Louisa Atkinson, they have had books and papers and articles written about them, so much research done into their lives. And so that the very first act of research that we did together gave us this incredible discovery. It gave us great hope and fortitude to know that our journey was actually going to be one of true discovery.
And there were so many other amazing things we discovered on the journey along the way. Just so many tiny little details about her life that we didn't know, big things, little things. But one of my other favourite discoveries here was this particular book here, which is the Reverend Wools, and it was his sermon that he gave when Louisa, Charlotte's fourth child, her daughter, died, and he talked about her life. And there's a few really interesting details in here. But we discovered he talked about the fact that Charlotte had written several books. And this was the first clue we had that it wasn't just a mother's offering to her children that Charlotte had written, that she had written other works as well. And then we found other clues as well, didn't we?
That's exactly right. So we were here in the Special Collections room at the National Library, and Belinda and I are working through the many, many, many boxes of archival material. And then, Belinda's reading this particular book, and she turns to me and she says, "Isn't this fascinating? This sermon says that Charlotte Waring Atkinson was the author of more than one book." And we thought, I wonder what else she could have written. And then I was going through the Marcy Muir archival box. Marcy Muir was Charlotte Waring Atkinson's biographer. And I found a hand-scribbled note that simply said, P&P Tales, ? And I thought, I wonder if Marcy Muir was wondering if this was a book authored by Charlotte. And so I began to research, and over time I discovered that there's a book here in the Special Collections called Peter Prattle's Amusing and Instructive Tales, and it contains a short story which is the first time a story was ever set in Australia, in literary history of the world. The first story ever to be set in Australia was published in this little illustrated chapbook called Peter Prattle's Amusing and Instructive Tales. So of course I pulled up the book and then I examined it, and through a process of, let's call it linguistic forensics, I came to the conclusion that that book, that Marcy Muir was right, that book had been written by Charlotte Waring Atkinson, which means that she's not only the author of Australia's first children's book, but she's the author of the first piece of fiction set in this country. And that was the most amazing discovery.
It was quite incredible. And we also found, I found another reference to her having written several works. So with everything we have to substantiate it by having 3 pieces of evidence. And so we had the Reverend Wools, we had the other reference to it from the 19th century biography of Louisa's life, and then we had the Marcy Muir note. So that was so exciting.
We feel that we are so lucky because so much of our research, we were able to draw upon our oral history, the stories that we were told by our grandparents and our mother as we were growing up. And as a child, we were completely enchanted by these stories, you know, the romance and the drama and the intrigue of Charlotte's amazing life. But as we grew to be adults, we began to doubt the veracity of these old stories.
They seemed too amazing to be true, didn't they? They seemed like we thought, she must have been far more ordinary than that.
That's right. We thought, of course they've been romanticised. Of course they've been glamorised. And so when we set out on our journey, when we were searching for the truth of Charlotte's life story, we were expecting to find our childhood family mythology being debunked. But
demolished, in fact.
Exactly. But what we found is that many of the stories that we were told as children, this oral history, turned out to be true.
Absolutely.
And that was, I think, one of the most amazing discoveries of all, because it shows how stories that are passed down through the generations, they carry within them a kernel of truth. And by listening to the stories of our forebears and of our parents and our grandparents, we actually do receive truths about our ancestors and about how our families were shaped.
I think so, but I think we were incredibly lucky because our family were writers, so they all wrote. And so it wasn't just Charlotte that wrote stories about her life and wrote her journal, and her children, both her daughters, the elder daughter Charlotte and also Louisa, who was the first Australian-born female novelist and journalist. I mean, they both wrote articles for newspapers. They both wrote articles, stories, handwritten family histories.
Letters, journals. And
so we had this incredibly rich primary sources that we could use, which just brought those characters to life, those people to life. And also the other thing that was amazing was the trove newspapers. I mean, I just can't believe we've got all these digital newspapers going right back to the very early days of the colony. And we could go through and we could see they were all prolific letter writers. So James Atkinson was always writing to the newspapers. Charlotte, there was just, not only that, there was advertisements that talked about how sad it was when they threw Charlotte out of Oldbury and they put the house up for let, and it had a listing of, you know, how many sheep they had and how many cows they had and how many rooms they were in, and it was this incredible list of that gave a real insight into their lives. And later on, when Charlotte was selling another property, it gave us these really interesting details into what she was doing at that time, when she was running a school. All of these discoveries we could make through the newspapers, which were just, I mean, I got lost down those rabbit holes for weeks and weeks and weeks, following these little tiny leads, which sometimes led nowhere, but other times led to these incredible discoveries.
We had a rule. We had a number of rules when we were writing this book, but one of our rules was to remember everything was fascinating to us because we were making these discoveries about our own family. But our rule was, it might be interesting, but is it relevant?
Absolutely.
And so we had to choose what to keep in the book and what was probably not of interest to anyone outside the family.
Exactly.
And so that really helped us, because at some points in the writing of this book, we were so overwhelmed by the difficulty of the research and how much material there was, and how difficult it was to read the faded handwriting, written with a quill and ink, how difficult it was to know if the things that we found had significance or not. I mean, just one scribbled note from Marcy Murrell led us to this amazing discovery. But if we hadn't had that serendipitous moment where Belinda was discovering in one book that Charlotte had written more than one published work, and then I almost simultaneously found this note.
Yeah, it was almost simultaneously.
We would never have put the two things together and made that amazing discovery. So it was a series of astonishing serendipitous, findings that led us to many of our most exciting insights.
It was, and one of the things I loved discovering in the National Library archives was there was these beautiful letters and little handwritten family histories that were written by very many different members from our side of the family. So there's when Louise's daughter, Louise, and Janet Kosh collected an amazing history, but she was very much focused on her famous grandmother, Louisa Atkinson, whereas our side of the family were more interested about Charlotte Elizabeth Atkinson, the eldest daughter. And so for us, it was amazing finding these sort of records in the National Library that had been carefully collated and put aside in boxes, and the fact that they all cared so much about this that they wanted to write it down and record it. And some of them were rather outlandish, some of their ideas of the family history,
Some were a little bit romanticised.
But it was still fascinating nonetheless. And then to sort through the wheat from the chaff really and work out and just double check everything and find out what actually was real and what was true, and then enjoy the romanticised, exaggerated parts of the story.
But it's a very good thing that Belinda and I get on so well, because we spent so much time together rummaging around in these archival boxes, getting very tired and
dirty and dusty. No, they're beautifully kept.
And so, because we were able to work together, I think that we were able to, make some of these discoveries, well, perhaps without, the fact that we are sisters, we wouldn't have made quite so many.
No, possibly not. And also, I think our backgrounds were really helpful because we both worked as journalists, so we're very used to research. We're very used to keeping very detailed research notes, but we've also both written a lot of historical fiction. So we've both written many historical novels, which meant we could combine that meticulous note-taking and meticulous research together with the creative imagination of bringing that world to life, bringing Charlotte's world to life, bringing that whole 19th century colonial society to life. And so we're very lucky. I think it's almost an incredibly unlikely pairing of authors where we were not only sisters, but we also had these very similar literary skills.
Absolutely, and we were able to, work on different parts of the book, know what we were searching for, and then, be able to write our own chapters. So we weren't trespassing on each other's area of expertise.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So sometimes that's probably what we might have disagreed about the most, was what parts of the book we were both fascinated with everything.
That's right. So after Louise Snowdon walked all the way back to her home, carrying her armfuls full of these treasures, she held on to them all of her life, and in time she grew up and married and had a daughter of her own, Janet Kosh. And Janet Kosh inherited this incredible archive of materials of her grandmother, Charlotte Waring Atkinson. And in time, she felt very strongly that they should be saved for the future, that Charlotte Waring Atkinson's incredible achievements in her life, struggling through grief and loss and violence and this struggle to live an independent life, to write Australia's first published children's book. This is something that should be celebrated and should be studied for the future. And so Janet Kosh gave her collection to the National Library, and that is why we have it here with us today. It was a great gift.
Absolutely, so precious. I hope you love reading our Searching for Charlotte.
The fascinating story of Australia's first children's author.